QuickBooks Online 2025 Journal Report. Get ready and some coffee because we're learning how to save time with QuickBooks Online 2025. We are online in our browser searching for that QuickBooks Online test drive, the free sample company file available to everybody looking for the result that has intuit.com and the URL, Intuit being the owner of QuickBooks. Choosing the United States version of the software, and then we're going to tell QuickBooks I am not a robot and I am offended that you would claim me as such. Not that I have anything against robots. It's just like, dude, are you blind? Can you see? For crying out loud. Anyways, we're in the sample company file. Craig's Design and Landscaping Services. We're going to go to the reports down on the left-hand side in the standard tab. Favorites, let's right-click on that balance sheet to open a link in a new tab. Right-click on the profit and loss to open a link in a new tab. Tapping to the middle, and we'll close up the hamburger. Close that hamburger, put that top bun in place so we can get on with things here. 010124 tab 123125. Selecting the drop down, we're going to see it in years and then run it because we want to be refreshed. 24, 25 side by side, tabbing to the right, closing the hamburger, repeating the process with the range. 010124 tab 123125 tab, selecting the drop down to see it in years, and then we're going to run it to refresh it once again. All right. So these are the major two financial statement reports. We're looking at the other reports, usually giving us more information about one or multiple line items. Let's go to that first tab, going down to the reports, which is already open, closing the hamburger, and we're scrolling all the way down to those accounting reports at the bottom. And so these are the reports that are usually going to give us more detail, like general ledger type of reports, but also those that have debits and credits involved in them. This time we want to take a look at the journal report. Quick comparison with the journal report. It's similar to the general ledger report, which is similar to the transaction detail by date or by account and by date report. But the journal report's going to give us more detail. So let's just take a look at all of these now that we've discussed a few of them. Let's open them. Right-click on the general ledger report. Open that in a new tab. Right-click on the transaction detail report. Open that in a new tab. Right-click on the transaction list by date report. Open that in a new tab. And then finally, the one we're going to focus on, the journal report. Right-click and open that in a new tab. Taking a look at each of these. One by one, side by side, going through them systematically. Let's go to the general ledger report as we saw before, 010124. Let's go to 123124, let's say. And this is the good old GL. Back in the old days, we dealt with the GL all the time, but these days they seem we can give information by just giving the QuickBooks file. So remember, this type of report is one where at the end of the year, you might give your accountant, your tax preparer, the financial statements. Then they would ask for more information about a particular account they had a question about or something like that. And you give them the general ledger report. But now you just give them the whole QuickBooks software, and they can, in essence, go into the balance sheet, for example, and simply drill down on particular accounts like the cash account, giving them a transaction report, which is basically a general ledger report breaking out the detail by date. So let's go back. So that's what this one, you can see that report is similar to this report, but instead of having just one account, it has all of the accounts, therefore quite long of a report. But it gives it by account and then by date. If I look at the transaction list by account, transaction detail by account, you got a similar report. We're now in the modern view of the reports. Let's take a range change again. Custom date range 010124 010124 to 123124, let's say. And similarly, you've got the transaction detail, looks pretty similar. I don't even like almost exactly the same. Transaction number, name, split, transaction number, name, memo, full name, account. So it's pretty close to, you know, the same thing. Few different line items, but similar in that it's giving you the detail by first the account and then by date. But then we saw the transaction list by date's doing something different, dude. Let's close up the hamburger and check it out. And just for a recap, customize that one, going from 010124 to 123125. What happened here? What's your problem, man? 010124 to let's go to 2424. So now this one gives us the information, but it's not broken out by account. It gives us the information by date of transaction. And then we can sort it by date. We can also sort it by transaction here, which is nice. And we saw that in part this might be nice because it might help us with billing, for example, so that instead of billing by hourly, we bill by number of transactions, which we saw we can basically export this report to Excel, for example, and then simply use the count function in Excel to count the line items and say, if I have so many transactions, this is how much I charge, and so on and so forth. The downside to that is that some transactions are more detailed than others, so maybe you want to be more specific and make your billing scheme not based on the transaction number, but rather on the number of accounts that are impacted, which this doesn't give as much detail because it only breaks out the account that's listed or lines up to the form and the second account. But if there's more than 2 accounts affected, it gives you this dash, and we don't get the added information. So also this report is useful because if you're trying to just kind of see what happens in a particular, as you enter forms, this will of course list out all the transaction types. You can list them by form, and then you can go in here and look at the transactions and see at how each form impacted the financial statement. However, again, it doesn't give you all of the accounts if there's more than 2 accounts impacted, and it doesn't give you the debits and credits. What if I wanted to learn the debits and credits? Well, then you could go to the journal report. The journal report. Let's close up the hamburger. That's where we're at. We finally got there. You finally got to the current topic. It's about time. Could I fast forward? You could fast forward if you want to. So we, on these presentations, let's go to 123124, the journal report. Now, when we say journal, it's trying to indicate journal entry, and it's mirroring the idea that if I hit the plus button up top, the form journal entry is here. So, quick reminder, when we enter information into the system, if you learned accounting from a textbook, you're going to learn by debits and credits, by journal entry, how to record everything. In QuickBooks and most accounting software, that's not how you do most of the data input. You do most of the data input by the system creating a form for all normal transactions, which will then make the data input easier. And so that you don't need to know the journal entries, those forms then will create the journal entries, the debits and credits, which will then be constructing the financial statements in the form of the accounting equation, assets equal liabilities plus equity. But sometimes there's not a form that could be used, and therefore you use the journal form, which is basically recording a transaction with debits and credits. Usually you only use it when you're doing adjusting entries at the end of the year, possibly done by a CPA firm or accountant that is trying to do adjusting entries to make the financial statements on as close to possible whatever accounting basis being used, whether that be an accrual basis or possibly a tax basis. And so then you would do these the journal entries at the end of the period. You might also have some transactions where you need the journal entry. For example, if you bought something like equipment, but you bought it as a loan, so you didn't pay cash for it, I can't use the expense form or the deposit form, and therefore you might use like a journal entry in that transaction. So over here, you might expect then that this form would only include transactions where you use the journal, but no, it's recording all the transactions, breaking them out in journal entry format the way you might see them if you were doing accounting, say, in a textbook, which makes it great for learning debits and credits. So if you're trying to say, what does my company record normally? I can see the transaction detail report here, reporting everything by the transaction type, and then I can see the debits and credits involved with the transactions, and not only the debits and credits when there are 2 accounts impacted, but for multiple accounts, such as this invoice here, right? So the invoice here We entered the invoice, accounts receivable went up, the other went up to landscaping services, which is a credit, and that's a revenue account. So we credited the revenue account. Revenue accounts only go up, therefore revenue accounts must go up with a credit. Accounts receivable went up, and they're asset accounts, and so it went up with a debit. So that's weird, right? It's going up, a debit, an asset goes up with a debit, and a income account goes up with a credit. So you start to build and say, why is that the case? And you can get into that. I won't do that now. We have many accounting, debit, and credit courses if you want to touch on that in more detail. But then we had another revenue account, multiple revenue accounts impacted. This invoice similarly had multiple revenue accounts that are impacted. A bill payment checking account went down. The other side went to accounts payable for the bill that was paid. So that gives us the more detail. So this would be a useful report if, again, similarly to the transaction detailed by date, but if you want more information in terms of all the accounts that are affected in one area, more detail. Now, from a billing standpoint, you could imagine, well, maybe I don't want to bill hourly. I want to bill by basically the number of transactions as a bookkeeper, but I want to take into consideration not just the number of transactions, but the number of accounts impacted so that I will naturally bill higher for more complex transactions, such as if I'm taking on payroll or I'm dealing with inventory, where I'm going to get longer kind of transactions. So you can export this to Excel and make basically your billing like count the number of accounts that are impacted. It's a little bit more complicated to do that because you have to deal with the subtotals. So you'd have to export it to Excel and then sort everything possibly by this column. Or you might like do a count if there's text in the field, because this column will only have the text field, but it's doable. You can export it to Excel. You can use a count if function to basically count all of the forms if there's something in here, like maybe count this one if there's a number in it or something of that nature. And then you could come up with a billing scheme based on the number of accounts that are affected. So that's the general thing. That's the general idea with the journal and kind of comparing these transaction reports. You can clearly sort by this account again, just like you could before with the transaction detail, and you might also filter. So if you want to look at particular transactions and the detail of them, you can filter by those types of transactions, the most common filter being by the transaction type.